All right. For a change of pace, I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of private censorship and blowing up lately. And it made me want to look into it and explore a bit. And I'm wondering if it's as secure of a mountain as the tech companies believe it is. Because I don't know, I'm no lawyer, but just in looking at it, it seems to me that there might be some challenges that perhaps a smart lawyer could figure out and launch, a multi-million-dollar class action suit or something. In any case, now we've all seen this new event, this new tactic that's been happening. This idea of deplatforming or cancel culture or whatever you want to call it. And this has been basically a very structured type attack where if a certain activism group disagrees with a speaker with the speaker's ideology, they would seek to get that speaker disinvited from a speaking engagement or removed from a platform that he or she enjoys. We've seen it a lot in person, in conjunction with Antifa demonstration and violence and threats, etc. And by and large, I would say that actually it's had the reverse effect. It's actually helped most of the people that they sought to ban because it increased their public profile. I think no better example than Jordan Peterson. But it's happened to Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, Charles Murray, Steven Crowder, all of the grievance folks, the grievance hoax folks. So it hasn't really worked in person, but it seems to be working really well online. And it's getting broader and broader. We're hearing now cases of people getting kicked off of financial services, most definitely people getting banned off of social platforms, etc. So let's kind of explore this for a bit. The first examples were Tommy Robinson and Count Dankula, and I'll touch on these briefly. I can't really delve into those too much because I don't know what British law doesn't necessarily have as many protections as U.S. law, but Tommy, I find it very interesting that he's been banned because there's been governmental representatives that actually reached out to Facebook, to the various places where he got banned, to Amazon where he got his book banned, and that should give us all a pause because usually it wasn't too long ago that if I remember there was an incident where I think the president of Turkey reached out someplace to have some comedian ban, and our response was a collective "fu." But somehow it seems that if the ideology is just so, they can paint a person in such a manner that our companies are just perfectly okay with it. And Tommy Robinson's sin is, he's being painted as a racist, as a Islamophobe, and all of that, but he's nothing of the sort. His main sin was that he was objecting to some fairly abusive practices that were beginning to spring up in his neighborhood vis-a-vis Islamic population that was moving in, creating a no-go area, basically causing violence, etc. And as he raised that, he became aware of this grooming gang. And this has to do with child rape, not just child rape, but serial child rape involving large numbers of children as young as 11. And he attempted to do citizen journalism. He stood outside the court, attempted to catch these guys on video to publish it, and for his trouble he got arrested. And it seems that what the real problem was, and I'm not certain as to sort of the legality of him being arrested for interfering with in the States citizen journalism was allowed. Perhaps maybe that's that there's a rule in Britain that makes it that much more difficult. But keeping the eye on the bigger picture, the challenge in that case was that many of the girls that were being abused had been quote unquote known to the appropriate child safety offices for a while, and they had not acted. So I think what the really deadly message, as if child rape and child abuse was not heinous enough, I think the really heinous message that he was being silenced for was that the UK authorities were basically at loath to act because they didn't want to be perceived as being Islamophobic. Want the accusation, so it took them that much longer to act, and therefore increased the length of time that these, horrendous individuals could continue to abuse them. I had never heard of a such thing as a grooming gang, and as I started looking on Wikipedia, I found more and more and more cases, and I mean, alone, I found about 10 cases, and these cases are not a question of a person raping a child. It's usually a question of a group of males, typically Muslim. I mean, not typically Muslim. Grooming seems to be a Muslim practice. I didn't find any other cases, and it involves a large number of young children being specifically sort of raised for sexual abuse, and in my eyes, it's a damn near pandemic in England. And the fact that it's being sort of marginalized in the news, it's not being talked about. I'm sorry, but while tolerance and acceptance and multiculturalism is a wonderful, goal to strive for, I think it falls far, far below child safety and being able to protect children from sex, from rape. Yet somehow, Tommy is basically being crucified on the public airwaves because he stood up for the children. That's ridiculous to me. Count Dankula, this just falls in the realm of the stupidly ridiculous. He basically made his pug do a Hitler salute as a joke for his girlfriend, and now he has been pushed out of his job by activists. He's not been able to be employed since. Every time he's secured something, he's had people turn up at his work, and I'm not particularly certain what exactly was his sin. He made a joke. I mean, you may not like the joke, but Jesus. So there seems to be these continuously encroaching activities that border, at least to me, they border on, they definitely are immoral. And I wonder if they border on the illegal. And again, I like as I said, I don't know about the UK law. So let's talk about more from the US perspective. And one of the cases I think we've all known about is Pewdiepie. And basically, Pewdiepie does a series of videos, has been on YouTube for a very long time, is now reaching almost 100 million viewers. So that alone, I think it's worth considering. Now, this is a guy that has a significant audience. And anytime I see other portions of the media attacking what is fundamentally a competitor, you have to ask the question about unfair business practices. Because if I am sitting there and I am a newspaper losing to the online medium, a cable news network losing to the online medium, I might be inclined to want to destroy as much of my competition as possible to lengthen my own survivability time. So that question isn't necessarily being raised in. So I want to put a little fine point on that. But Wall Street Journal digs through his videos and finds that he engaged these Indian kids to do something, and yes, it's somewhat objectionable, but it isn't. It is simply a joke. I mean, irrespective of its content. I'm not sure that. I mean, the content was, if you watch the video, was obviously, you see in the picture, he was shocked that they actually performed the act. He didn't expect that they would. But even so, it's simply a joke. It's, you watch the bulk of his content, he isn't racist, he doesn't condone a racial message, etc. So from a reasonable perspective, from a reasonable interpretation, a reasonable person perspective, you would not consider him a racist. Therefore, even the accusation of racism falls flat. But the strange part was that the accusation was coming from the Wall Street Journal. And it wasn't just in an article, but they actually created a video, and it was tailored to make him seem that much more sort of racist and race baiting, etc. I mean, it was just it was very disturbing. And not only that, they reached out to Disney, in which he had an ongoing deal, and that caused his deal with Disney to be severed. And they also reached out to YouTube in an effort to get him kicked off. And then they published it, of course, for public consumption. So that's interfering with a contract that's existing. Because, say what you will, PewDiePie makes money, and a lot of money, for YouTube and for himself by doing these videos. That he has an arrangement with YouTube. However, it might, it may not be in the form of a specific offer-proffer type contract, but there nevertheless is an agreement between the two companies. And when a third party attempts to basically interfere in bad faith with one of the two commercial parties, that's a crime. It's called tortious interference. And it's a criminal act. It's not a civil act. The libel, the defamation, all that stuff, that can be a criminal act at times, but given that he's a public figure, it would have to be maliciously, malice has to be a motive. But again, when your motive is to deprive someone of their living, I think you can prove malice. Even more, PewDiePie actually had to intervene on the behalf of the two Indian dancers because somehow they also complained about them. And they were no longer allowed to be contractors on Fiverr. Now this, again, they get $5 for doing whatever, whatever silly things that they have to do. These are guys in a barely, in an underdeveloped area of the world making $5. And somehow there's some person out here who had their knickers in a twist and needed to get them to stop earning a living. Now that's just purely immoral. So again, tortious interference is a criminal act. That's basically when one person intentionally damages someone else's contractual or business relationship with a third party, causing economic harm, which would be exactly what has happened to PewDiePie and what has happened to many. Also, there is the aspect that if you accept, if you break the contract on spurious grounds, if you would, you could also be guilty of breach of contract. And I think that there's an element there also where if the accusation comes to, say, YouTube or whatever the other party is, and it's being withheld from the person with whom it actually affects, I'm wondering if there isn't a certain element of collusion on the person initiating sort of the tortious interference and the tacit acceptance and the collaboration between one party of the contract and the contractor of tortious interference. That's one line of thinking. Now, at a minimum, we can establish intent because the Wall Street Journal reporter was very clear in his condemnation of PewDiePie. He didn't receive much blowback until much later, so they were very entitled in their self-righteousness. So there is a point in which you could establish that there was intent to economically harm, which is malicious intent. Whether or not you felt you were righteous in your goal, in your approach, it doesn't matter. If you take an ideological stance on something, just because you're unable to see your bias, it doesn't mean that your action is any less malicious. And it did cause Felix to break his contract with, or it caused Disney to walk. So I'm wondering if Disney is in fault, if Wall Street is in fault. And then they also attempted to break his arrangement with YouTube, and I believe they had some impact, but it was short term. That's, so that's one thing. Now, the reason this is a topic now is because Senator Hawley is trying to take this bill that begins to attack this this mythical 230 shield, and I wanted to drill into that on what that specifically is and what the bill is and what my thoughts on it are. So in today's code, there's basically two definitions of that internet or whatever that computer system providers tend to fall into. Traditionally, we had always approached them as more of a utility, much like AT&T being a phone company. Internet companies usually kind of fell into that category, more of an extender of communication, and most definitely did not fall in the publisher category. And let's explain what the two are. A public utility is basically a company who has taken over a public service, and while it is subject to certain regulations, it does not seek to police the content of, or the method in which that utility is being used. So you don't sue AT&T if somebody used the phone to plan a murder. A publisher is literally a publisher. I mean, a institution that publishes some printed material, some content, some news, some video content, audio content, written content, whatever. They are responsible for the words that they are publishing, so they can be sued if those words are libelous. And in an effort to not oppose the natural growth of the the phenomenon which is the internet, this act was passed, this 230 field, which is what Senator Hawley's seeking to reverse. And what did that involve? So this is sort of the introduction. This really doesn't say anything. This has to do with all of the various goals that Congress has to not interfere with the internet. That's just kind of a little bit of patting themselves on the back. But this is the material section. And section C, protection for good Samaritan blocking and screening of offensive material. Now the goal here was that they wanted to give the ability for companies that in good faith they would stop objectionable content, like say terrorism, recruitment, child pornography, things of that nature. So one is treatment of publisher or speaker. So basically, what type of treatment will they be subjected to? No provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Now that doesn't necessarily say much, but basically they're saying that if this is not your content, you won't be tagged with it as your own. So in effect, they're giving them a little bit of a break from the role of publisher. Okay. And then specifically for civil liability, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be held liable on account of any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or user considers to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, blah, 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 blah. Now, these definitions aren't legal definitions. They're simply words. So, and especially since you open it up with the otherwise objectionable, you put it to a reasonable person test, which really opens it up. The other hole, I believe, is this idea of user. I think while their goal was the user would be sort of the affected party, the person who would complain, I would put forward that the user is also the person getting banned. But I really wonder if there isn't some large opening where we can drive a truck through this. But this basically specifically says whether or not such material is constitutionally protected. So this is specifically a defense against the restrictions of free speech. Now again, civil liability. This is in civil cases. There are instances in which you can claim criminal activity. There's certain instances of libel that are criminal acts, and tortious interference is a criminal act. And the obligations, this other section doesn't say much. It basically says that people are interested in parental control, you should point them to where they should. So this is really the money part of this act. The other part here, which is basically that's how it fits into the remainder of law, it reinstates fundamentally what this is. So this says specifically that it's a civil liability. This clearly says no effect on criminal law or any other codices. So it's not intellectual property. This doesn't come up. So this protection does not extend into the areas of criminal law, intellectual property law, state law, communication privacy, and sex trafficking law. So there is quite a bit of opening there. I'm very surprised when it comes to cases like Alex Jones, which I'll discuss in a minute, that some of these things have not yet been explored. And I would hope that we start, because it seems that given enough of a lead, these companies are just simply running off at a gallop and just making the rules up as they go. Now, as I've said, defamation and there's calumny, defamation, libel. There's a variety of different states have different definitions of it. People that are public, quasi-public, or temporarily public have different protections under the law. So all of these are variable. So I'm not going to go into all of the ramifications. But there's also this idea of false light laws, where you begin to, which is something that's becoming more and more prevalent in today's coverage, where something is being taken out of context, being shown in a specific light. And while this is specifically for a non-public person, so this would apply more to, say, the Covington kids, for example, which is why, you know, they're engaging in such a large lawsuit. Specifically, I would say that even though this this specifically applies to a non-public person, I wonder if there is some traction to be had with simply being able to identify the definition. Because the publication of information is false, then a tort of defamation. So basically, if it's false, then it's defamation. If the communication is not technically false, but it's still misleading, then a tort of false light might have occurred. But the idea is that it establishes that the concept of false light, and yes, being a type of libel that is not quite defamation, and it's against a non-public person, but it also establishes criteria on how to identify it. But what if your goal is not to sue for libel, but rather to establish that this criteria was met, and that is the tortious act of interference? You're not suing for libel, you're suing for establishing the maliciousness of the tortious act. So I'm wondering if that can be used. Now, that's simply around libelous nature of communication and being able to get some protections from this, you know, private company shield that people keep throwing up. Now, let's talk about YouTube in general. Just set your mind back to when YouTube was just coming out, back in the days of Video Cafe, and when MySpace was still cool and Facebook was something that the Winklevoss twins, you know, thought that they actually still owned. If you're a creator, you create content, and it's content that ideally is creative enough to attract viewers. If you're an up-and-coming platform, you're looking for creators because what you need traffic, you need interaction, so you need viewers, and you don't have content, so you need content creators. So the simplest interaction would be the platform provider hires content provider over here, and he brings, because of his content, brings a viewer. And same thing happens on this side, and because they both bring a viewer, the viewer also cross-pollinates. So key actors in the starting stages are the platform provider, the content creator, and the content viewer. I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, as you begin to get into sort of the goals of the company, the platform provider, YouTube per se, the platform wants to attract many more interactions because they have a plan, like most of these platforms, that when they reach a certain critical mass, they want to insert the ability to monetize, to advertise this traffic, this interaction traffic that they have. So obviously they need creative creators that attract more and more and more viewers. So now you go and you create content, and the more pieces of content you create, the more views you get from your viewers, the more viewers you attract, and you also generate views on your content, and you also have those viewers that you attract that generate views on another creator's content. So far, so good. Now you've reached a certain level. So in the case of YouTube, under this agreement, there was no monetization. It was just simply, you know, come to us. We will post these things free of charge for you in exchange for you getting us viewers. Right? That was the agreement, in effect. YouTube gets seen by Google. Now Google wants to buy them. They acquire them, and they bring their ad platform on top of it. Right? Now you've contributed to the building of the value of this company, and now they've been acquired. Now, to the degree that they've extended an offer to you to host these things, there is some sort of obligation on their part. I mean, they'll insist that there isn't, but I'm saying in the spirit of a commercial agreement, you have contributed in good faith, and if they change the rules drastically right now, and you're somehow harmed, then that's probably not operating in good faith. Now, phase two. Google now has introduced this concept of advertising, so now you have another player, the advertiser. So the advertiser says, you know, I'm going to pay you 10, talks to Google, says, I'll pay you 10 tokens. I didn't want to put a dollar value, but say 10 tokens per ad presented. And I've got lots of ads that I need presented. Now, whenever that same interaction, whenever a new interaction happens, Google sticks an ad onto it, and says, hey, whenever I'm going to stick an ad, I'm going to pay you 2 tokens to you as the creator. Now you hear that, you go to town, because now this motivates you. You're motivated by revenue. So now you start producing a ton more content, and you start upping the quality, and you start looking at very creative ways to create more engaging content, to drive cross-pollination of that content into multiple viewer streams, to use other social platforms to advertise for that, for the publication of that content. So now you're advertising on, Snapchat and on Twitter and whatever. You're specifically, driving more topics for engagement. You're cooperating with other creators, so that way their viewers come to your site and his viewers, your viewers go to theirs. So now you're actively engaged because there's a monetization in the agreement, and you've now attracted sufficient viewers that you generate a monthly income of X number of dollars, which translates to so many tokens. And the way that that's established is that basically it's the number of viewers you've attracted to your content times the 2 tokens times whatever engagement, let's say the engagement rate of the quality of your content. Let's say your content engages 1 out of 3 people that stumble upon it and actually watch it. And then of course the secondary piece to your income is whatever other viewers you were able to cross-pollinate from other places times your content, again times the 2 tokens and the engagement rate you have. That's the value that is driven to you. That's your salary. That is what you're being paid. Similarly, you are driving some additional component of value towards another creator, because much like you've cross-pollinated from some populations, your viewers now have gone to other creators as well, and they're assisting their value creation. So now you've got this sort of imprint of value into many other creators. It's a smaller one than perhaps yours, but it is a contribution that is coming because of your attracted users, right? And something happens. They don't like your videos anymore. Something changes in the zeitgeist, and all of a sudden your videos are blocked. Now, I'm not talking about whether or not they're demonetized. I'm talking about you're cut, you're gone. So they've cut off relationship. You no longer have any recourse. You're given a reason, or maybe not, but you're out. So the platform continues to do its thing. It'll still have its business. It'll still continue to sell the same way to viewers and to content creators, but you no longer have a role. You no longer have an income. However, your contribution in some respects continue to derive value for them, right? So there's the idea of, when you chose YouTube, these rules didn't exist. When you chose to monetize the first videos, the rules that you violated in the end were not present. So at which point was the introduction of them appropriate, right? Is there any sort of severance, consideration needed to be given to you for the value that you contributed in sort of a good faith agreement? So these are the sort of questions you need to ask. Also, there is the idea that, on one hand, if especially in the case of a very prolific creator, like somebody like Alex Jones, or somebody that had significant number of views, at which point is this reason of severing the relationship simply a pretext? Just cut someone off because you are paying them a significantly larger check, and you feel that, hell, I've attracted his viewers, they're unlikely, they've reached sort of the threshold factor where they're unlikely to leave me, and I don't need to keep paying this guy for the users he's already brought me. So at which point this becomes a little bit of an unfair business practice. So let's kind of detail through that. So when you get demonetized without warning, the reasons for demonetizations are not based on very clear and published rules you understand and can follow reasonably. Then they're actively engaging in changing the conditions of a contract, whether it's a de facto contract or not. You're not being basically treated fairly. If channel strikes, things that lock out function in your ability to generate money, so all of a sudden you can no longer live tweet, you can no longer publish new content or whatever. Now, if you're making money off of this channel, these actions have now started penalizing you. You are no longer earning money. While this function isn't permitted to you, you are being deprived of earning money. So that is a punishment. Now, when that's because somebody decided to hit you with a false copyright strike, and they've got a period of time in which that strike can mature and whatever, where you can dispute it, well, it completely reverses the standard for innocence, which is you're being accused of something by a third party. The third party is not the one that has to prove it. You have to prove you're innocent. And compound matters, you're being penalized while you're proving you're innocent, which is a complete reversal of the spirit of our judicial system. Now, the extreme case is banning. When you delete a channel, again, if it's unclear reasons or reasons that didn't exist in the formation of the agreement, that's one set of questions. If the response is against a complaint from an activist, this is where it becomes a little bit specific, because majority of these typical complaints, they tend to be inflated and often untrue because they're based on an ideological bias. So, for example, if you said something like, well, I believe one girl was banned off of Twitter for saying, well, men are not women, though. That is a biologically accurate fact. And Twitter chose to interpret it as being sort of dead naming and being offensive, blah, 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 blah. But all of these are subjective, all of these interpretations. And while, yes, as a private company, they may be entitled to a certain level of subjectivity, at the point where it causes you to sever something that is a money-making organ for you, at that point, it begins to interfere with your living. It interferes with your ability to pursue happiness, if you would. And it borders on that tortious interference area. It also deprives you of other rights, like due process. Like, for example, you're being accused. If you're unable to confront your accuser, right, then an element of due process has been gone. And again, the typical response to this is that, well, it's a private company. Yeah, but the private company only shields so much. If these are criminal acts, no private company can have policies that overrule criminal acts, that forgive criminal acts. You can't waive your rights by entering into a private arrangement, unless you very explicitly say so. And again, despite what the current state of the law is, I think the real discussion has to be this. With the amazing success, so if you look at Apple iTunes, developers can get onto Apple iTunes and sell their software, and they grow like wildfire. And then it extends to content. Now, content creators, on YouTube, on iTunes, on Spotify, they sell their hardware. Well, they've made billions of dollars on this. At what point are they simply not just a new type of employer? So in this modern gig economy, what type of responsibilities does YouTube have towards the creators? And this is a question that actually was successfully explored before in the dot-com boom days. The practice was in California was to hire contractors because they were much easier to handle from the perspective of when you had to lay employees off, you had to report them with your public company. That tended to take a little bit of toll on your stock. So many of the Bay Area companies, or many of the California companies, in fact, actually, I think Microsoft was the biggest one hit in part of that reversal, was that they would choose to hire significant amount of contractors to the point where they had people that were fundamentally staff. They were doing the same job as a staff member, and but they didn't have to follow the same reporting. They didn't have to offer health care. They didn't have to do all these things. So upon further inspection, there was a case which reversed all of that and basically changed the means by which you the length of which you can hold a contractor, and at which point you have to treat them as an employee, etc., etc. Well, if fundamentally you are offering, now granted it's a contractual agreement, it is 1099, a third party, whatever you want to call it, but at which point does the law have to, in effect, dip its foot into this water? This is just simply a new type of employer, and we have a quite robust set of labor law in terms of wrongful termination, discriminatory practices, having your rights protected, because in its nature, employment is your right to pursue happiness. It is your the right to pursue a living. This is why, for example, non-compete contracts are illegal in California, because they would prohibit you from being able to pursue a living. If you are engaged as a creator, for example, in California, what rights do you have to be prohibited from pursuing that living? Is anyone infringing on you? Is YouTube removing your ability to make a living, and you have no recourse? So I think those are things that bear examination. And of course, keep this in the backdrop of, this is the text again from the famous waiver. Any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access or availability of material by the provider or user considers to be obscene. So at which point does certain speech or certain accusation towards you become the exact objectionable material that you might be accused of, because you too are a user of that said platform? Now, let's focus on Alex Jones a bit. Alex Jones, as you might know, is the primary voice of the show called InfoWars, which was syndicated on radio, and it was on YouTube and on iTunes and on every other podcast carrier out there, and it had a ridiculous large audience. At any point, he routinely would dwarf any one of the top performing shows in CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whatever, in terms of views. So not an insignificant player. And then on 7th of August, he found that nearly all of the social platforms that he was accustomed to being published on had banned him, had dropped him. And a CNN reporter basically took credit for that and claimed it very triumphantly. And of course, Vox, Slate, the Washington Post all piled on, condemning Alex Jones, not condemning the act, but condemning that finally he basically pushing all of the praising all of the tech companies, and then decrying why Twitter, because Twitter was the odd man out, they didn't, because he hadn't violated any rules as of yet. They were all pushing for his dismissal on Twitter. Now, of course, Twitter, waited for about a month to dig in, and eventually found an incidence of his behavior in the real world, and for some reason they were able to back engineer that into a violation. So he got banned off of there too. So, okay. Now, again, we're in that same space. This guy's creating, he's earning money on these platforms. Bam, he's gone. One, CNN is a competitor of his. Pure and simple. He plies in delivering news, CNN plies in delivering news. Granted, his are conspiracy theories, but fundamentally they're plying for the same audience. So at which point does CNN, have they exceeded their market position? Because they happen to have a cozy relationship with the tech companies, and it seems that it was very much a coordinated attack, as it's visible from the timing. So there definitely was a conspiracy to execute this. There was a conspiracy involving the voices that responded in attack and the people that responded in terms of banning him. It doesn't have to be a clear conspiracy. It can be what's called an inchoate conspiracy, in which one perpetrator picks up a portion of the act and then stops, and then somebody else, a co-conspirator, picks up and does the second piece. Right? It doesn't have to be in communication. It doesn't have to be necessarily in tight planning. To make matters worse, just recently, a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal decided to basically tweet a story that was quite fun. Again, looking at those false light type laws, they were re-reporting on something that some publication basically was publishing as a story, and the entire gist of the story was that Alex Jones had sent porn to the Sandy Hook victims, in fact, to the parents of the Sandy Hook victims. And you had to dig in for the actual detail, but the gist of it was to make him look like he's sending child porn to these poor victims of the parents of the victims of Sandy Hook. When, as you begin to read, and you literally have to get to the very last sentence, it's clear that the FBI found, they're in the midst of a discovery in the Sandy Hook case, where he had to provide his emails to the opposition counsel, and emails were sent to the InfoWars server from an external source containing child porn. And in the act of giving this over to, or his attorneys giving the hard drives over to the Discovery, then yes, FBI found such such pictures. So it is a complete reversal of the direction, basically smear in the most heinous way a person who now isn't on this platform. So it isn't just so much the act of libel or the act of defamation or whatever, but it's happening in a platform where he has no ability to respond. So he has no means to defend his name. So now we're stepping beyond just violation of his First Amendment. Now we're talking about his right to due process, his right to confront a witness, all of that. So is it possible that originally CNN engaged in unfair competitive practices? Did they engage in tortious interference to cause his lawful agreement with all of these carriers to be terminated? Were they in fact was there a conspiracy to do so, both on the part of Slate, Vox, and all of the other amplifier voices, right? Or on the parts of Facebook, Google, YouTube, whomever, all of the tech side companies? Because obviously he wasn't engaged in that dialogue. He wasn't engaged in that negotiation, and I would venture to think that the checks that were involved were not small in terms of the amount of viewers he was generating and the amount of clicks that he would have been generating income from. So is it a question of simply it was worthwhile for a lot of these platforms to kick him off because this was a check they would no longer have to pay and they've already attracted these users? He's been on there for a while, so he's already sort of acclimatized them. And is this an abuse of their market position? Further, because he's had his speech curtailed, if you can say that perhaps Twitter isn't necessarily a complete monopoly, but when you're banned across the entire board at the same time, now at this point you're pretty much being locked out of the digital, market, digital public square. So how big does most of have to be before all of a sudden you've had a significant deterioration of your First Amendment right? Secondarily, you're being accused in this public square that you are no longer participate. You're no longer allowed to participating. Therefore, how much are you allowed to defend yourself? At which point are you allowed to basically defend your name, follow due process, defend against accusations, etc.? And again, going back to if he was an employee, then was there labor law that was involved? So I don't know. I think it's high time that we start looking at some laws that actually not only do they not provide the indemnity, I think we need to start looking at protecting the users, because I think increasingly it is those users of these platforms that are the ones that are abused. It's their data that's being taken. It's their money, their income that's basically being removed without warning. It isn't as if the tech companies are suffering. It's the users that are suffering. And although Senator Hawley's presenting this bill, I don't know that I'm on board with it, because if you read it, it really empowers the FCC to have the power to gauge whether or not a company's biased. And I think that just spells disaster, because A, there's no competency at the FCC to gauge that. There's every likelihood that it biases towards one political view or the other, and even if it doesn't bias towards view one in this cycle, it'll immediately reverse in the next political cycle. So to engage, to empower a certain political agency to gauge political bias, I think is just idiotic. I think we need to fix this in the law directly. We can't empower some agency to behind closed doors decide whether or not something's biased or not. It needs to be public, and it needs to be even-handed and publicly visible that it's even-handed. So either completely remove the liability, and then they have to fend for themselves in the open market. I mean, Google's a big boy, so is Facebook. They can handle the various lawsuits, and they'll police the content, because they police the content today. They just don't police. They don't police it even-handedly. when they can be sued about how they're policing it, then they have to be transparent and they have to be candid. So I think that trying to establish some sort of third-party watchdog that watches the scales of justice on our behalf isn't a transparent solution. So with that, that's it. Thank you, and if you like it, comment.